All right, well, thanks for taking the time to join this webinar. We're going to go over a few of the details around the latest organic enforcement rule that has come out from USDA. There have been a lot of questions from CFSA members and a lot of stakeholders in the community about just what kind of impact this has on organic operations. Some of you may have heard about strengthening organic enforcement. I hope you have. If not, we'll need to talk with some certifiers and make sure they're doing their job with sharing all the requisite information. But just to kick things off, my name is Matt. I'm the policy director with Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, and I'm joined here by Alicia. Alicia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Matt. Yes, I'm Alicia Bach. I'm the policy specialist for North Carolina policy advocacy work with Carolina Farm Stewardship.
Awesome. Thanks, Alicia. So this should be a fairly quick webinar. When we first set out to do some research on the impact strengthening organic enforcement had on producers, we weren't really sure what we were going to find, but the good news is we're going to go ahead and get things rolling here on the agenda. So we've got a little bit about CFSA. If you're on our agenda, if you're attending this, you probably already know a little bit about us. We're going to talk about SE TOPP, the initiative that funded a lot of this, what the rule specifically is, strengthening organic enforcement, as well as where we are now. The implementation has been going on for a little over 1 year. Um, Impacts that we're seeing on organic producers, those who want to transition to organic, as well as the impacts that we're seeing on the certifiers and any impacts that may be passed along to organic operations. And then get some input from you all. Kind of what are you seeing? What are your fears? What uncertainties do you still have around SOE? So just real quick about CFSA. So we are a farmer-driven, membership-focused nonprofit. We're all about trying to give resources and support to small and mid-sized growers, as well as the food systems they operate throughout both Carolinas. I'm based in South Carolina. Alicia's based in North Carolina. And our mission is just to advocate, educate, and build connections centered on local and organic agriculture. So just for just a little additional context on why we do what we do. And as you can see on this slide, it's a lot. So CFSA, our mission has grown over the years. We started out back almost a little over 40 years ago as just a collection of concerned organic producers wanting to build a more sustainable food system throughout the Carolinas. And now, as you can see, our four main hubs are technical assistance, both on-farm and virtual, research and education through our conferences, research at Lomax Farm, local food systems. So we support the markets that farmers sell to through programs like Farm Share, community building, and then the side of the shop that Alicia and I both work in, which is advocacy. So collecting information from producers, diagnosing policy problems they're facing, and then bringing those issues to the halls of government, both legislative and administrative, local, regional, and federal. And how do we do that? We collect that through word of mouth, through a lot of our on-farm technical staff who are finding out firsthand what farmers are facing. We have policy surveys that we will issue, having farmers rank kind of what their biggest issues are. And then also through our member advocacy program, where we basically train producers to be their own advocates. We're a small staff at CFSA. We can't be everywhere all at once. So we like to give you the tools you need to engage with policymakers and kind of be your own voice. So that's a great opportunity for us to kind of really collect some intel on what farmers are facing on the ground. And we've got a QR code there if you want. If you're not already on our action alert list, we recommend you sign up because we're only as powerful as the totality of our voice. And the more members we have, the louder the voice. A little bit about SE TOPP and kind of what organic support systems we're using to kind of do this webinar and then do other events to kind of support organic producers. So SE TOPP stands for Southeast Transition to Organic Partnership. This is a program that was launched by USDA a few years ago, a little over 3 years ago. And it's carves the country up into 6 distinct regions. So our partnership is with Rodale Institute, along with Florida Organic Growers, to kind of diagnose what is it that's keeping organic producers who are functionally organic from taking the leap and becoming certified organic. Once we identify those barriers, how do we address those? How do we mitigate those problems? And through this project, we're really trying to learn exactly what our issues are on the ground, what barriers exist for organic producers, what makes your life harder, and then how do we fix that? That's done through four ways. We've got a mentorship one-on-one program that CFSA partners with burgeoning organic producers. Our technical assistance, which kind of dovetails with the work we're already doing in the Carolinas, along with community building. Again, this is not a CFSA-led endeavor. We partner with, half a dozen other groups throughout, like Georgia Organics, Florida Organics, Clemson, NC State, all with the same goal of trying to help organic producers. And then workforce development. And we do that by trying to figure out what tools, what is it in terms of labor and workforce as a barrier we can do to help organic producers. Um, Increasing domestic organic production is critical. So we have kind of, through the last 3 years, really gotten some clear pictures on what the biggest barriers are for organic producers, and we can go over some of that towards the end. One of the things we routinely hear from producers is um, unfair and scale inappropriate enforcement of rules, which is what brings us to today, trying to kind of really go over what's going on with the strengthening organic enforcement rule. Is there anything there that's keeping producers from becoming certified organic? Is it hurting organic markets? Is it helping organic markets? Is it cracking down on import fraud? Things like that. Is it leveling the playing field for domestic producers? All questions that we tried to tackle in getting ready for today. So what I'll do now is I'll turn it over humbly to Alicia Bach, our North Carolina policy specialist, to kind of go over the background on SOE, what it does, why it was written, and then moving into the next slide, we'll start to talk about where we stand and how we see all this kind of rolling out in practice. Alicia?
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, so as Matt mentioned, this basically has been in place since March of 2024. So it went into effect after much communication from USDA prior to that. So prior to that, we had almost a year to get ready. So this was something that was actually delineated by Congress as a regulatory action to USDA. And the reason that it started was because the National Organic Program was hearing so many complaints over the last, I don't know, really gearing up over the last 5 years about organic fraud coming in from imports, specifically on grain. So it started with organic corn. There was an issue with organic grain from Turkey. There was an issue with organic soybeans that had hexane extraction. And we weren't really prepared, I guess, as a US importer. We didn't have enough infrastructure to basically either test it out or understand how it was going to be caught at the border. So the reason that this whole thing started, they wanted to strengthen organic enforcement. That's how that SOE acronym became part of the regulation. Congress basically authorized USDA to change the national organic rules for the first time since implementation in 2000. So it's a big deal. The purpose, again, was mainly to address organic fraud, and it wasn't really meant to do much on the domestic side. At least we were hoping that it wouldn't. However, we realized that importers, brokers, warehouses, there was a lot of loopholes that were being identified, and realizing that a lot of brokers who were importing these products were not certified organic. So it was a realization by USDA and Congress that we needed to do something, because otherwise the risk of consumers no longer trusting the organic seal was going to be detrimental to the domestic organic industry and producers here in the Carolinas, as well as farmers across the country. So the impactful change was electronic import certificates was the main driver. We were trying to centralize that. USDA had this database for supplier certificates, and they were going to start using that as an import certificate brokerage as well. So the certifiers became the number one recipient of all these changes, because the certifiers actually had to put in place a lot of new regulations and a lot of new procedures just to manage the import process. So our biggest concern was, how is this going to impact our domestic producers? We were hoping, everyone was hoping that this would actually create an even playing field for organic domestic farmers, so that they wouldn't have to compete with lower priced organic imports of grain specifically that ended up being fraudulent. So, domestic producers were being undercut in price, and also, the risk was that they couldn't compete on such a small scale compared to the big importers, from other countries. And then the other huge change, which I think people are still kind of trying to figure out, especially on the processing side, organic fraud prevention plans are basically new, and it requires every certified entity to do a fraud prevention and a vulnerability assessment on their supply chain. So again, for domestic producers, especially for our small farmers in the Carolinas and across the country, in theory, you guys are growing your own food, so fraud prevention should be relatively low risk for you. But for processors who import a bunch of ingredients, this was a huge deal. They have to go through their entire system and verify whether there's any fraud potential. This would impact things like organic coffee beans, organic cocoa, anything that comes in from another country, they have much more high risk. And I think that's where USDA was focusing their initial focus. So that's the background, Matt. I don't know if you want to go ahead and change the page. I would say a year later, almost a year and a half later, what we're finding, especially on the processing side and import side, way better transparency, way better authenticity, much stronger monitoring. They're actually putting in place potential changes to pesticide residue testing, prohibited materials such as hexane in soy. They're trying to figure out a way to make that happen. But I can say for a fact on the customs side, there's much more scrutiny on imports, and there's also much more likelihood that a lot of these uncertified brokers and importers are either no longer there or they're switching to being certified organic, which was the goal. So supply chain transparency has been much better. We don't have as many issues with fraud in the import certificate area, and also the tightening of the management of import certificates through one database has been good, but also challenging because the database, unfortunately, some of you might have found, has had a lot of technical glitches and issues. So we're still working through that. I think the other thing is this bill that they're talking about, Organic Import Verification Act. Again, that bill is in Congress right now, so we're not quite sure whether that would be something that's going to happen or not. But the National Organic Standards Board and the National Organic Program are definitely aware of this and working towards it. So I'd say overall, the implementation has been good for what they originally wanted to go after. And, we'll talk a little bit more later about whether this has really had an impact on domestic producers. I'm finding personally through the folks that I've talked to that the farmers on the ground and the, small farmers have been less impacted than we were thinking. We were hoping that they wouldn't be, and it seems like that's been relatively true. So again, the domestic farmers really wanted to have help basically saying, hey, you know what, we don't have to compete against fraud from other countries. And it also was hopeful that we would be able to increase domestic supply of organic ingredients. That was also the goal. So therefore, we wanted to have more domestic producers consider transitioning from conventional to organic, which is the reason that the TOPP program was implemented. Have we seen some detrimental impacts to this? I would say some. Certifiers, again, we're going to talk about that later, but certifiers did have to potentially add staff. They had to make sure that they could actually have enough people to implement these new regulations. So renewals for organic handling, which happens every year, had to be considered. Certification costs may have had to be passed on. And then again, supply chain verification and fraud prevention did have to be implemented. So each certified entity had to put in more steps on documentation, which unfortunately kind of went in conflict with the original proposal a few years ago, which was sound and sensible, which was supposed to be a way to make people have less paperwork burden with organic. And unfortunately, this kind of went against that. We did see more residue testing in some cases, but it was basically on a risk basis. So it was things like hexane in soy, GMOs in corn, things like that. The other big concern that we had for our farmers was non-retail labeling. There was a requirement that said you must have an interim label on anything that you're transporting. And for us, we were like, oh, if that's going to happen where you have to put some sort of an organic placard on a farm vehicle that goes from one farm to another, that's going to be very hard to track, especially if you have to put lot numbers and stuff on there. So we pushed back on that, and we tried to make sure that they said, these particular requirements must be reasonable, especially for small producers. And then we were asking the NOP if they could track, or if they were tracking, how many farmers didn't renew with organic certification. I think we're still trying to work through that to see, did we lose people? Did we lose people that said it was no longer worthwhile for this? And I think I'm going to turn that one over to Matt, for the next
Yeah.
slide.
Yeah, one thing we're looking at is we're going to be charting, through a combination of like the NASS survey data and working with NOP to kind of figure out, is there a dip in organic certification, either new ones or yeah, continuations of certifications when that's commensurate with the rollout of the strengthened organic enforcement rules. If there's a dip there, that warrants some more inspection. One thing that when we partnered with this webinar with Clemson as well as NC State and some others, um, as the picture kind of came into focus, as Alicia said, it looks less and less like the costs are being explicitly passed on to producers, but rather the certifiers are having to absorb a lot of the paperwork and a lot of the red tape that goes along with this. So both our friends at Clemson and NC State indicated that most of the work's fallen on them to actually implement this rule, and that's through everything from unannounced inspections, where they have to inspect at least 5% of the operations they inspect annually have to be inspected. There are supply chain traceability audits that have to happen during inspections where you're tracking the inputs, the ingredients, and then comparing that via mass balance audits where you look at the organic inputs compared to the organic outputs to figure out if there's some discrepancies there. Again, all more work that has to happen on the certifier's end. Um, Dovetailing with that, increased staff standards. So most of the staff who work in the inspection divisions, both the inspectors and their admin staff, are having to go through additional trainings, continuing education courses, work on curriculum to make sure they're all not only up on what this rule enforcement entails, but also just general organic inspections. There's a higher standard that all the inspectors are going to be held to. Combined with data sharing. So, with a lot of these complex organic supply chains regionally, forget internationally, even regionally, with the complex jurisdictions, you're having to see increased data sharing between certifiers. So, between Clemson and North Carolina and Florida Organics and some of these other groups, there's a higher standard for data sharing between them as well as through the National Organic Program to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page and they don't get bogged down in mission creep. Like I said, the good news is we were really worried these costs were going to be passed on specifically to the producers, but we're able to stand down a little bit back to DEFCON 5 because it looks like it's mainly with the certifiers. All right, Alicia, any parting thoughts?
No, I appreciate everybody who was here, and yeah, happy to help anytime you guys need to answer any questions.
Thanks, everybody.